the new college grads come on, all they know is how to push the spreads on the computer. They think they need to redesign the airplane. Well, the Wright brothers had it on. They already knew what to do. They don't screw. Unless you're going to fly in outer space, you've already reached what you need. They don't even need to do it. This is it. Yep, this is what works. Get to those bolts on the bottom of the boiler.
Oh, wow.
When you take all the jacketing off, but all the piping and all the appliances are all off of it as well. So it looks like it did when it was delivered from Alco with the boiler. There's your boiler assembly.
Wow. Was it leaking or anything? All the bolts good?
Most of those bolts are getting redone. Renumbered and re-renumbered, but that's all it is. Only change on paper.
How many stay bolts are there?
Just short of 3,000 total on the entire boiler.
How many have you done so far? You haven't started.
I don't know where they're at.
Yeah. You're getting new bearings and bushings and everything.
Bearings are actually in good shape.
Cool.
Those had been done, so they're in good shape.
At all that unscrew. Every one of them, with the exception to a few of this style. There's one band that used to think. All the rest of them are this style. They're all welded on. So they've all 2,700 of them. They got to be cut off. So I got to make tools that will look kind of like that. That cup, the spring-loaded plunger, that's what I wanted in my own design. And then Austin found this picture from 1934. But anyway, this cup will go over here and keep this centered. And this has replaceable cutters, which is what I wanted. Because if you chip one and they're not replaceable, you're screwing up the whole tool. What's that? Oh yeah, well they will be after all of the years. I mean, you can't avoid that. Back then, their water chemistry was essentially nil. They didn't care because they were going to have the boiler apart again and again and again and again and again. They didn't care if they got a little scale. Now, because we only have one of these, you know, water chemistry has become a big issue. And the better you treat your water is going to come from all over the country. It's all different. And what you ultimately want to do is you want to have your minerals settle but not hit the bottom. You want them to suspend so that as you blow out the boiler, and you've got blowout devices all over the boiler on the bottom, you want all those minerals to gravitate toward those blowdowns to get rid of them, instead of settling in the bottom and making scale. Or laying on everything like a fine layer of dust on your furniture and then getting glued with it. And that's what happens, it bakes on. And we've got flue tubes outside that have scale on them that look like paint. And because the water chemistry was never kept right. But the thing of it is the majority of what's been happening in the past, they had like a swimming pool testing kit. Okay, that's fine. You go to the hydrant, take a sample of water, get your pH adjusted, and then if you care, you go up on the tender and get the right chemicals and pour them in. As the tender is filling, so it stirs it up. Not have a full tender and then pour it in, and it's sitting over in this corner of the tender, and this water is what's making it into the engine. Kind of defeats the purpose. So yeah. The bosses have already let us know that water chemistry is going to be a big thing. And that'll keep the flue tubes cleaner, that'll make the heating more efficient, and everything will just last that much longer. Because the thicker that scale gets on there, it's kind of like putting porcelain paint on your oven. It's an insulator, and the heat is not as effective. That's right, you bet. And the more heat you apply to it, once it gets started, it's like a stalactite. It just gets worse and worse and worse. It just keeps accumulating. Something similar to this, poured in, and you had a removable welded-in sleeve, you would have that sitting down in that little cup that you just made. You'd get the appropriate angle, and then you would weld it in.
But as far as the front,
With the big boy, this actual undercut is cut with a smaller one of these into the boiler shell itself. The staple goes through, and the boiler shell has become the cup.
I've never seen it torn this way.
And granted, it's not as efficient because if that little cup gets screwed up, you can't just cut it out and replace it. You have to cut a chunk out of the boiler shell and actually weld in a new patch and then bore that hole and make that cup all over again. So it's a lot more work. But the 18 years of expected use of those, they didn't care. If they had a stay bolt that was kind of fussy, they just put the cap back on and welded it over because they figured it's going to be all right. They're running them every day, and they'll wait for it to go in for its major overhaul, then they'd fix it. And we've only got one of each. So yeah, we want everything to be good. And we don't want to screw up the boiler shell. That gets really intense. It's a 1-inch thick piece of steel that we're cutting into. And you've got to weld that not only inside and outside, it has to be a complete weld. So that means you have to bevel the inside. But yeah, 2,700 of these little bars all over that thing.
And what does that bolt? That is a staple.
These are all stable. They are what you see
sorry.
right there. The sleeves, that's what holds the firebox suspended in the middle of the boiler. And because the firebox receives so much heat, the outside does not. That's why they're flexible stable. Because that firebox is welded to this end, there's water here, and this is the outside shell. And this expands and contracts a whole bunch, so it can move around about 15 degrees.
Besides the frame doing all that.
Oh, sure, and the water sloshing up against it and everything else. It has to move or they would bust. In the places where you're not going to get any movement, like that flat part on the side, you use this part. That's a fixed.
Maybe those squares.
That's threaded through both layers of metal, even though they're that far apart. You have a real long cap, and it keeps that thread continuous all the way through. You screw this in, and then once that's been screwed in, you have two people, one inside, one outside, running an air hammer with a tool like that, and that takes and cocks it, as they call it. It rounds that over like a mushroom. You'll see those little mushroom-looking things with a hole in the center, and they've all got a hole in the center. And the reason for that is if this breaks, it'll pee water out and tell you that it's broken. It's a telltale hole, as they call it. All stay bolts have them. And this one being under a cap on the outside, the sleeve, it only needs it on the inside. Because if you had it leaking under here, your boiler jacket's covering all this, you wouldn't see it. But you're going to look in the firebox every day. So if it's leaking, it'd be peeing into the firebox, and the telltale hole goes all the way up here. When they make these, they squish this ball in, put it red hot, and then they plug and weld this end of that telltale hole, seal it off.
That completely encloses the axle and the bearings, right out almost to the inner side of the wheel. And that casing has a machine, like a square area machined in it, not quite square, that fits in. You can see where it's kind of polished there. So, and that big bar across the bottom, you can take that out, and then you pull the engine over the drop ring, which is down there, and what you can do is you can lower a whole section of, like a section of track that's long enough to hold the wheel, that you drop the whole wheel and axle out the bottom, move it sideways, and then you can pick it up with a crane. But basically that whole axle and wheel assembly, that cast iron casing that's holding the axle and the bearings, has a mating surface for this part. And it just slides up in there, and then you bolt that big bar back on, and that's all in there. Right. And then the springs, the springs are all tied together. So this is how the spring looks like it feels in place.